friends, family, and cohorts. Welcome back to the Fight or Flight podcast. This is episode 31. Our goal this year was 30, and this episode is the crowning jewel. It epitomizes deep thought, continuous learning, and the fight to stay relevant, informed, adaptive, fit, and present. Today, we host an individual whose pedigree is clickbait for every thinker, leader, and warrior. Commander William C. Spears. The pedigree. He began as an enlisted sailor in the Navy's nuclear program. He transitioned to the United States Naval Academy. He holds multiple advanced degrees from institutions like the United States Naval Postgraduate School and the Eisenhower School for National Security. He's a submarine warfare officer who has served as the weapons officer on a fast attack boat and the executive officer of a Trident missile submarine. He currently advises the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. The commander is here today to discuss, apply, and perhaps defend the philosophy at the heart of his command, Stoicism, which is explained in his new book, Stoicism as a Warrior Philosophy. Our goal today is to dive in deep, to discuss, apply, and perhaps explore his rationale for diving into this philosophy. We're going to challenge this ancient system with modern warfare's most brutal demands. Commander, thank you for your service and for bringing that deep curiosity, and welcome to the show.
Miles, really appreciate it. I love the diving deep puns. Like they're unavoidable.
I'm sorry. I listened to some other podcasts with
No,
you.
it's great.
Everyone was hitting you hard with those. I'm like, I got to drop anchor and have some fun with it. Sorry.
Submarines actually have anchors. That's a thing.
Come on, are you serious?
Yeah, we almost never use it. It's one of those devices that, okay, we're going to go off on a tangent now. So as the weapons officer, I owned the anchor, which is, it was just a thing that's like, it belongs to the torpedo division of submarines. And it's all the way back in the very aft end of the engine room, as far away from the torpedo room as you can get, are the controls for the anchor. And it's this thing that like fares to the hull, and it's built in. And basically you have to test it every now and then to make sure it still works. And it's a pain to maintain, but you never use it. It's almost never use it, but you have to have one for, if you ever need it, you really want to be able to use it, but you want to have it available. But it's like this trivia point of why do the torpedo men own the anchor? And it goes all the way back to World War II, like old diesel submarines where you had an after torpedo room, where the ship could shoot backwards And so the torpedo men have always owned the anchor on our submarines. And so it's
That's
just
crazy.
this thing that they have to maintain. Anyway, before we get down track, I have to say it's important for me to point out for your audience that because I am actively serving in the military, I need to say that I am just here speaking as myself. I'm just William C. Spears. Anything that I say is not representative of the U.S. Navy or any department of the government. It's just my own dumb opinion. If I don't say that, then somebody somewhere I'll render an opinion on Taylor Swift or something, and everyone will say, the Navy thinks this. And no, it's just me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the self-depreciating humor. There's nothing dumb about you. And I know you're going to take me to school on this topic. So, all transparency, I was a little nervous leaning into it and tried to do a quick deep study on Stoicism. So thank you for that. And I appreciate why you just shared that. Hey, I'd like to ask a trademark question. I think it's a great place to start to let the audience get to know who you are a little bit better before we dive in. I'll try and stop with the dive in stuff. Commander, 3-part question. Who have you been? Who are you today, and who are you becoming?
Sure. So I came from a small town in Louisiana, and I graduated high school and just joined the Navy as soon as I left high school for a variety of reasons. It seemed like a good path. Patriotic service was in there somewhere, kind of an undeveloped. It seemed like a good thing to do, but also seemed like a good path to training and education, and it absolutely turned out to be that. And so I wanted to pursue school and education. So I basically picked the hardest program I could find from that standpoint. And it ended up being the nuclear power world. So I went to go train to be an electrician aboard nuclear powered ships. You learn all the reactor theory and stuff like that. And it's 2 years of school before you ever make it to a ship. Whenever you take that path. And my philosophy, my parents had advised me that if they offer you school, you take it. If there is something that you can apply for, you apply for it. That's just going to be, there's lots of opportunity in the military. So that was kind of, has always been my approach. And so I immediately started applying for everything that I could. And I got into the Naval Academy from there, and that was kind of a remarkable transition, and just remarkably lucky opportunity for me to have. And then, so before making it to a ship as an enlisted guy, I basically completed all the training and then went to a year of prep school and then went to the Naval Academy from there. And, I wanted to, for a variety of reasons that are another topic, came back, I aimed for coming back to the submarine force. And so that's what I did. Majored in mechanical engineering, about as far from philosophy as you can get. But
Yes.
but that was what was most useful for the Navy, and so did that. Went back to nuclear power school as an officer, and then went on to a submarine career from there. And that's kind of where I'm at. I am now. I've been in the Navy a little over 20 years, depending on where you count. I'm married, got 3 kids, very very happy life, very happy career. I have completed a tour as the second in command of a submariner, the XO. I hope to go on to be a captain of a submarine in my next tour. Right now, I'm at the Pentagon in between ships, looking at spreadsheets of how expensive ships are. There's a million different reasons that I might not go on to be a captain someday, but that's what I'm aiming for. And if that doesn't work out, that'll be fine. But the Navy's got to figure out what it's going to do with me. And so in the meantime, I get to promote this book that I wrote mostly when I was supposed to be paying more attention in war college. So it's been a long time coming. It's a longer story than that, but that's the basic idea of where I'm at, where I'm going. Who I am.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, a lot of personal development in there.
Clearly, were you always a good student? You took the hardest path possible. A lot of rigor, study, and discipline, or engineering, science, STEM, it all came naturally to you?
Nothing has come naturally, and what I would say is I don't know if I would describe myself as a particularly good student. I've never been what I would describe as an A student. I've always been kind of a B plus student. And if I can, like, if it's going to take me 4 hours to get an A and 1 hour to get a B, I'm going to get a B and use that as extra 3 hours to do something else. And that has led to things like writing a book on philosophy that has nothing to do with any of the current curriculum. Because
Oh,
that's kind of an approach that I've never been the really competitive person that's like, I've got to be the top of my, the top of my game. I'm Iceman. I've got to like, whatever. Like, you guys can have that. I'm gonna go pursue this other thing that's actually interesting to me. And that's kind of my game, and it's worked out wonderfully. I think that's, yeah, I've gone to advanced education in the military. The Navy's sent me to war college a couple of times, or variations on that theme. And I think that the way you get the most out of, especially a postgraduate education, is you follow the rabbit holes and the things that interest you, because there's going to be just this mountain of books, and you're supposed to read it all, and you start reading it and you're like, man, I would really like to, this author is citing this author over here. That sounds really interesting. And I would like to go and see what the heck that author said. But instead, I'm supposed to read all this crap. Like, I'm going to just be like, yeah, okay, I got it. Anyway, what does this other author over here say? And that's kind of, that's been my approach the whole time. And I think that has led to a lot more growth than pursuing the A would have.
wow, that's
And mind you, like, I get good enough grades, or I have gotten good enough grades that I've been able to, have lots of opportunities and pursue them. But half of that's just pursuing the opportunities as they present.
or creating them. You impress
Yeah.
me as being pretty buttoned up. So to hear this is quite remarkable. I didn't see you that way. I saw you as uber competitive, top of class, but very much in control. So there's hope for those of us that aren't that way in the world. So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, and like, I'm glad there's people like that in the world, but like, it's just not me, and I think it wouldn't serve me well, or it wouldn't serve anyone else well for me to be that way.
Yeah. Hey, the world's lacking, in my opinion, humanness today. And so let's bring more of that to every deliberation. Let's pivot for a moment. Stoicism. Let's align. Let's get our audiences in tune for those that aren't as familiar with the term. Can you explain what it is and perhaps the cardinal virtues to it?
Sure. So Stoicism is a ancient philosophy. It comes from the same period of Greece as, that Hellenistic philosophy, where you've got like the Athens, you've got Socrates, and then you've got, the skeptics and the cynics and the Aristotelians and Platonics and all these guys, arguing about the nature of good and all this stuff in Athens. And the Stoics were a key component of that philosophical scene. And I think that they were among the best of the ideas to come out of that time frame. And the philosophy of Stoicism is kind of exploding in popularity right now. Largely, that's driven by a few like key influencers that put out popular books on it and everything like that. But people, there's something to it that people are finding is very helpful for them today. I think that there's a lot of psychological reasons for that because there's a lot of interplay between the Stoic philosophy and Stoic ideas and mental health
Mm.
therapies, and that's kind of a different tangent we can go on. But the basic idea of the Stoic philosophy, the basic point that they promoted is that virtue is the sole good, or virtue is the only thing that is actually good. If I consider a piece of food or wealth or status or something like that as good, the Stoics believed none of that is virtue. So it's kind of irrelevant. It doesn't really matter. It's not bad. It's kind of irrelevant compared to virtue. So what is virtue? Well, virtue is a human being's propensity to be what they are supposed to be at a moral level. And so you mentioned that word, the cardinal virtues. And so that is like if you take virtue proper and try to divide it into different qualities of a good human, get a you've got an infinite number that you can come up with, but they all kind of reduce, and within the Stoics view, they all kind of reduce to four cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, self-control, and justice. Or like justice, what is that? Like justness is a better way to describe it. It's being a just person and, treating other people correctly. Those four virtues, the Stoics did not invent that idea, but it reverberates through their worldview in many different ways. But that actually idea came from Plato, or is probably best attributed to Plato, many generations before the Stoics. And that idea reverberates through all kinds of other philosophies, not just the Stoics, but the Cynics and all kinds of other schools of Athens considered themselves the proper philosophical descendants of Socrates, who was largely written by Plato at the time. And then that idea of the cardinal virtues has been taken up by various religions and other schools of thought over time because it's very intuitive and it makes sense. And it basically, the idea of those virtues works like the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue, where basically any kind of shade or hue of a good human reduces to those ideas, or some derivative of that, whether it's generosity, magnanimity, charisma,
Sure.
industriousness. That's gonna be some application of wisdom and justice and all those things. And so that's a very useful kind of way of thinking about what a human is supposed to be. So the Stoics basically said, okay, being what you're supposed to be, that's what matters. And like we can argue forever about what you're supposed to be and what actually constitutes virtue, and that's a very interesting digression. But the ideas that follow from it, well, if virtue is the sole good, then all these other things that I might scramble after and obsess over are really indifferent things, and they therefore do not merit my emotional reaction. And so that's where the term stoic, has kind of evolved into an adjective of being unemotional. It's not the philosophy of suppressing emotions, but it is the philosophy of managing emotions. And so in their view, all emotions are judgment calls. So if someone cuts me off in traffic or something, or someone insults me in a meeting, and I get angry, that would be a judgment call that I've been harmed in some way, that this action has been bad or harmful. And in reality, my emotion that's coming from me. That's my responsibility. And I am the one who has made myself angry in reaction to this situation that is beyond my control and is effectively weather. It's effectively like raging at the weather. These emotions just don't make sense in this situation if I really think about it. And so they train themselves to control themselves and to basically identify the useless emotions that are based on incorrect judgments and try to eliminate them. And so that's where stoic has become an adjective for unemotional. again, it's not about suppressing emotions. It's about managing them, which is where a lot of the interplay with psychotherapy comes. So that was kind of a long answer, but
No,
I
this is
think
great.
it gets at a lot of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to circle back on a couple points. Let me just pause and recap my takeaway. Let me know if I'm tracking. Virtue is the sole good, number one. That's the foundation of the philosophy. The 4 bullet points, I grabbed wisdom, justice, courage, and temperaments. Or
Temperance
just,
or moderation or self-control. I tend to say when I'm given an elevator pitch on it, I call it
yeah,
self-control because temperance just sounds like abstinence from alcohol and stuff. And
okay.
another way it's often translated is moderation, and that just sounds like being lukewarm all the time. It's being prudent about how much I take or how much I have. Ultimately, it's a self-control. All the different kind of ways they talk about that particular virtue is self-discipline, self-control.
And then do I understand that control can be broken down into judgment, desire, and actions? Are those the 3 pillars?
So that's it. What you were talking about there is a different tangent, and so you can stop me at any point. That gets into their theory of mind and how the mind works. And again, these guys were writing before, long before running water and electricity. So there are a lot more sophisticated theories of mind today. But this is it is a useful way of thinking about it. What you just named there, assent, desire, and action, are what the Stoics believed. And this is like a couple layers. I don't really talk about this in podcasts or elevator pitches that much, but you asked. It's deep under the hood. But in their idea of what is like inside my mind, what functions of in the Stoic theory of mind are basically imagine kind of a command center with 3 different zones of control, or 3 different operations of what the mind is doing. One of them is assent, one of them is desire, and one of them is action. And these are really rough translations of these old Greek words that don't translate quite perfectly into English. But assent is what I was just talking about, which is the function of assenting or rejecting to the various impressions that come at my mind, and saying like, okay, I've been harmed in some way by this person's insult. Like, wait, stop. That's the impression, that I've been harmed. Actually, I have not been harmed, because I know that virtue is the sole good. And this thing that has occurred has nothing to do with my virtue. It's just something that is external to me, something that has that, I have no power over, and it's weather. So I have not been harmed.
Mhm.
My virtue has not been harmed by this, so I have not been harmed. And so that is assent, and basically accepting or rejecting the various impressions, which is incident information into my mind. Desire is like, this is roughly translated. So it's not necessarily about the idea of, I'm going to decide not to desire this donut. Like, that'd be great, but donuts are actually quite delicious. So, like, on some level, I'm probably going to want that donut. The faculty of desire within the Stoics' theory of mind, and gosh, we're getting real nerdy real fast here. It has to do with the kind of metaphysical idea of fate, and recognizing that the Stoics believed that everything, there's a causal chain going back forever, that basically the things that occur were always fated to occur. And that's just kind of like, that idea is called determinism. And you see it in various other schools of philosophy. But the idea that we live in a predetermined universe, that basically what is going to happen was always going to happen. And you can get into these digressions about free will, and well, if I was always locked into to eat that donut, is that really my responsibility then, because I was always going to eat the donut? Like, yes, you idiot, it was your responsibility. The Stoics do not agree to any kind of conflict between free will and a predetermined universe. But you've got other people who argue that point, that like, well, if that criminal was always destined to be a criminal, is he really responsible? Like, yes, he is. We
Yes,
can talk
sure.
about why, but that's really nuanced. Anyway, desire in the Stoics, that as a faculty of the mind, in the Stoics, like command center of the mind, is about appreciating that events were always fated, and that we should desire them to occur as they do. It's trying to capture the appreciation and gratitude for the world that we live in, and the present. And then action is exactly what it sounds like. It's disciplining of the center of my mind that's going to take an impulse of like I should eat that donut and turn it into I am now eating the donut.
Yes.
It's the point from that basically moves from I assent to the impression that I should eat the donut, and now I'm going to do it. And it's kind of like the last step in the mind of whatever action I'm going to take. And
Very cool.
yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's those ideas, assent, desire, and action. Again, you don't see a lot of that. You only see that in the kind of popular Stoicism discourse that goes on today. You're only going to find that in like the really nerdy stuff, because that's several layers deep. And the people who give like the kind of surface level treatments, they're generally not going to talk about that stuff.
It seems rather intuitive. I mean, assent to me seems like reflection, and that seems to be an important component. Actions seem like presence, self-agency, and moving forward motion. Desire, whether it's fate, predetermined or not, impulse disorder or not, I don't know. That I'll leave alone, because
Yeah.
that can mean something different to everyone. But the concept of judgment, desire, and actions really resonate loudly with me. And the reason I ask that is I read a book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. So man's, the essence of it, and for the audience, individuals survived the Holocaust, not the largest, not the smallest, not the most powerful, not the weakest, but he survived. And the question became why? Why he among others? And he spent his life studying this. He developed logotherapy, and a part of the logotherapy was purpose. When one loses their purpose, whatever that may be, their North Star, they're more susceptible to anxiety, depression, and decline as a contributing part of our community. So how does the concept of purpose interplay with the word virtue?
Well, virtue is, and again, this is wave tops on complex complex argument, but virtue, according to the old virtue ethicists, of which the Stoics were one of many schools that kind of debated about this stuff, but they all generally gravitated around the idea that virtue is following nature, being what you're supposed to be. Purpose is that, or telos, what in the military we often call mission. And that's not, my mission is to go and drive my submarine over here and observe this event or sink this ship or whatever. My mission, as the reason that this submarine exists, the mission of an attack submarine is to destroy hostile ships. That's why we build it, so that it can do that if required. The mission of the Naval Academy is to develop midshipmen morally, mentally, and physically, and to imbue them with the highest ideals of duty, honor, and all these things I had to memorize. So the mission, or the telos, which is the old Greek word for this, is the purpose of something, or the reason it exists. So what is the mission of a human being? What is the telos, or the purpose of a human being? And like, my gosh, like that's a deep, long rabbit hole. But the basic idea is to develop and manifest the faculties that make that human being different from anything else, that separate humans from animals, which is the faculty of reason. No other creature can reason like a human can. So the Stoics viewed the faculty of reason as kind of like this almost divine ability that kind of separated humans from animals, as much as animals were separated from plants and plants are separated from rocks. It's kind of this other level on the continuum. And it's incumbent on the individual to develop and exercise that faculty. That is the responsibility of the individual. And in their minds, in their theory, if you are doing that, if you are thinking and reasoning through things, you will see that behaving in all the ways that we would call virtuous is what is the appropriate thing to do and is the good thing. And if you are being virtuous, and if you reason, if you think about it long enough, you will know that pursuing wealth and conning people out of their making bad business deals or whatever to try to get rich that's not only is it not good for them, it's not good for you either.
Sure.
Anyone is just bad and unwise and all the things. And so basically virtue follows from reason is the idea. And the Stoics often say, what a human being is supposed to do is live in accordance with nature. And that is a very easily misunderstood idea. What living in accordance with nature means to them isn't birds and trees and stuff, going and going camping a lot. Living in accordance with nature is with human nature, which they believed was to be virtuous as distinguished from animals, and that is synonymous with to exercise reason. And so to live in accordance with nature is to exercise reason such that I become virtuous, and to try to become more virtuous over time as I develop intellectually.
This is great. And I want to get into some practical applications of this, but I'd like to navigate a little bit around a couple other questions just to bring some alignment and some familiarity to the philosophy so that when we do some practical applications in your mental models, everyone's got a base level of understanding. I've always viewed the Stoic as the individual. It's about me and how I respond to desires. My judgment call is how I respond to actions or infractions to me, or how I impress others. Me.
Mhm.
You use the word human nature. Human nature to me tends to mean community. It tends to mean collaboration and cooperation. What's the interplay in Stoicism between the individual and the greater community?
Yeah, I think you're kind of beating around a very big misunderstanding or a very common misunderstanding of this. Because if I go around to saying, well, my virtue is the sole good, it's the only thing I should worry about. And so it's this kind of navel gazing, internal focus. It does not follow from the precept that my virtue is the sole good that I should not care about anybody else. It just follows that I should not let things that I cannot control me. But the trope that the philosopher or the philosophical person is some guy living on a mountain in a loincloth, issuing platitudes. That is as far removed from Stoicism as anyone can be. In the Stoics, idea of the ideal wise person
Yes.
is more like a pillar of the community. Oh,
Yes.
okay. They were deeply focused on or emphatic about human beings being, naturally designed to work together. Like flocks, herds, and beehives and all those things. Humans are kind of a beehive too, and in their view. And that scales to families and to cities and countries and all those things. But kind of everything that I do has to be recognized inside of a social context. And so there is a huge moral responsibility there.
Sure.
Now, what is my responsibility? Like we can debate that internally, and now we're in politics. But the point that I'm making is, I'm no man is an island, in their view, and the ideal wise person is a pillar of the community. So I hope that kind of gets at it. Like, and that plays into why Stoicism became popular in Rome. Hundreds of years after the Athens philosophical scene kind of dissolved and all the philosophers scattered to Rhodes and Alexandria and other cities in that area, and kind of it petered out. Then philosophy grew up again a few years later, a few generations later, and Stoicism is now popular in Rome, especially among the kind of senatorial class, people who are well educated, but also have, deep senses of patriotic duty and responsibility. Stoicism resonated with these people a lot. And that's kind of why guys like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius were deeply fond of this way of thinking and found it very useful and resonant with the values that they had at the time.
Yeah, really good stuff. Thank you. Much clearer now. So let's flip the script. Let's go into some practical applications. Are there specific mental models that you do every day, or mental models that are tried and true that you say, hey, this is a good skill that I've developed as a result of Stoicism that I would guide others to consider?
The most popular construct within Stoicism that kind of it's kind of a magnet to the popular community is something that people often call the dichotomy of control, which is separating what I can control from what I can't and recognizing what I can't. And it's all kind of captured in the serenity prayer of Alcoholics Anonymous. God grant me the courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to or the serenity
That's
to not
accept,
yeah,
it's
accept the
something
things I
that's
cannot
right.
change and encourage change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference. Anyway, that's not from Stoicism, but it captures just eternal wisdom of I shouldn't fret about things I can't control. So some popular author about back in the 2010s called that the dichotomy of control, because it is a dichotomy. I can control things and I there's some things I can't. And that has, echoed through the blogosphere of all the popular Stoic stuff. That actually what that author was talking about was the philosopher Epictetus, and the that was like a key point that he made was there are some things that are in my power and some things that are not. But what he was getting at is not just I should only worry about the things I can control and not worry about the things I can't. It's more complex than that. It's not that's not true, but my actions are going to be informed by recognizing what things I can control and what things I can't. Doesn't mean that I shouldn't, I can't control if recycling is going to help, but I should still recycle. like I should still vote even though I can't control which way the political winds are going to blow. The point that Epictetus was making that is often lost is that separation between what I can control and what I cannot control is a distinguishing feature of any factor, incident, impression, something that I observe or something that I experience, of whether that thing is a moral factor or not. If I can't control it, then it is not a moral factor and therefore is indifferent. Because if it is not a moral factor, it is not a piece of my virtue. It doesn't reflect on my virtue. So that is, it's like a philosophical test. I see some tragedy happening. Can I control that? Can I do anything about that? I regret this action of the past. Well, can I control that? No, that almost is effectively a different person. What happened in the past may inform my appropriate actions today. I may have a debt to pay. I may owe someone an apology, but should I be emotional about that? Should I ruminate on that and feel guilty? Well, no. Like there's nothing I can do other than what is appropriate today, now. And so that, what in the book that I write, that you see that cool knife logo on the cover, that's actually I liken that dichotomy of what I can control and what I can't to a philosophical razor, because it shaves off all the different, it can cut off all the different things like any other philosophical razor, like Occam's razor, Hanlon's razor, any of those ideas. The idea of the philosophical razor is that you cut off extraneous information or arguments. And what I call the Stoic knife is kind of the application of what is popularly called the dichotomy of control to isolate what is important from what isn't, and isolate what is a moral factor from what is a non-moral factor on the basis of whether I can control that thing or not. So I hope that kind of answers that question.
So
We went way far afield.
No, this is
but
great. This is great. So it's almost like if I'm listening and following, you go through a mental exercise of determining the morality of what you're about to do. You're in a process of removing distractions. And I imagine that's a matter of focusing on what the essence of the ask or the problem set is that you have to solve, and then taking the most prudent, direct line of action that will have the greatest impact for, as you said, human nature or the common good or the agenda that you're fulfilling. The question,
Yeah, the appropriate actions are almost always going to exist within a social context, though. So that idea of
yes,
isolating what I can control and what matters to just what I can control is just all about me, 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 me. Like that it doesn't follow from that like I don't have to worry about this guy living on the street over here. That's
sure,
that's not what a good human does. you know,
right.
so
So there's a sensitivity and awareness for your part of a broader community and how your actions affect others. Moral factor I struggle with a little bit in this sense. I try to stay objective with things. Morality to me has always been about perspective, mindset, and perhaps they're a value base. My values, a perspective and mindset is born and raised in the Western Hemisphere. I'm proud to be an American. I believe in democracy, but someone that isn't may believe that their moral factor or morality doesn't afford the same privileges or rights or licenses to a broader community or to a gender base or to a thought cohort. And so is that a fair statement that morality is very much individualized and or culturally based? And remove religion and government from the conversation. I don't want to talk about religion, government as influencing thoughts, but I'm keen on Stoicism because I then want to follow this up with questions about practical applications in the military.
yeah. Well, is morality relative?
Yeah,
Is kind of what it sounds like you're getting at. And I mean, reasonable people can disagree on all kinds of things.
mm,
Not just policy, but reasonable people can disagree on, what a good society does, and what is owed from one between one human and another, and that's going to be, people are going to disagree on those things. This is one of the reasons that I like the cardinal virtues so much,
Yeah.
because it's kind of hard to dispute, and people ask me if I teach my kids about stoicism, and like I'm in here writing
Great question.
about Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and these guys. And I don't teach my kids these names. They're my oldest is 12. Like, he doesn't need to know that right now. There will be time for that later. But I teach them about the cardinal virtues because that's universal.
Yes.
And so kids, cardinal virtues go. Like, what are the qualities of a good human? Wisdom, courage. What? Okay, what does that mean? And
Sure.
now we've got a great conversation.
Very cool.
But I think that is a hard thing to dispute. And the idea that virtue is effectively a form of knowledge, which actually goes back to Socrates before the Stoics, is, I think, a very powerful idea that is going to lead you away from all the disagreement points and the kind of ways of arguing that are
Yeah.
lead one down paths that end up just being contentious and not really productive. One of the things I can say about stoicism as a, we're tiptoeing around it here is like the politics and culture war stuff. You will find it's kind of a Rorschach test of values, in that it's not necessarily left coded or right coded, on the political spectrum. You will find players, people who get, they read the Stoics and they're like, they say, "Hey, these guys agree with me on everything." they,
Right.
they will. You'll find people who will say that. Well, if you really read the Stoics like I do, you'll see that they are hyper left wing, or they're hyper right wing. You'll find both, but what is both will have to agree to is that it is completely antithetical to ideas like victimhood and grievance and fear and loathing, all those things that kind of permeate and corrupt the political discourse,
Yes.
so it is inherently, stoicism is inherently anti-radicalizing. And so whenever you filter the discourse, you filter the arguments, and you say, okay, is that fear and loathing? Is that victimhood? Is that grievance? Let's take that out. And what you have left are just reasonable disagreements that have to be talked about. And, reasonable arguments between reasonable people, if you filter all that crap out.
Yes.
And so it is inherently anti-radicalizing. And that's one of the reasons I think its growing popularity is a force for good in the world. So
Interesting.
I hope that kind of gets at it.
No, it does. You've really helped me understand it a little bit better. I always looked at Stoicism as a philosophy of the aftermath, not a proactive philosophy. And through our series of conversations, I've learned differently. So I appreciate that. The rational pause, the taking account of what's coming in, the filtering of the information before action, the understanding of what impression you're leaving, not only to yourself, but to the greater community before that action. So thank you. Yeah, I'm tracking with you hard if I've listened correctly. So the question I have then comes through the ethical reckoning of pause versus speed and a practical application as a commander of people and a military agenda. If a commander, as yourself, has a millisecond in a fight or flight scenario, doesn't the stoic pause become a fatal liability?
I mean, ideally, you're going to do the right thing quickly.
Because it's muscle memory, or how
Yeah,
so?
that's the idea. That's the
Okay.
idea, is you inculcate these, ways of thinking about things such that it becomes instinctive. I mean, that goes back to, any form of curriculum. There's lots of overlap there with military training, but a spurious action in the wrong direction is worse than nothing. It's worse than a pause. I would rather pause than go the wrong direction, and ideally, if I am filtering my incident impressions on a day-to-day basis and saying, like, okay, I'm not going to get angry because this person, or I'm not going to act on my anger. I'm not going to deny that I'm angry. I am angry because a guy insulted me because he's a douchebag and he acted like one. Recognizing I'm angry and not overreacting to that thing and not making a fool of myself in this business meeting, training myself to do that stuff instinctively. Doing it in one dimension is going to make me better at doing it in another, and reaching for the proper tool in the bag and reaching for conditioning the response of I'm not going to react irrationally in this situation is the whole idea. Making it natural, and no one's perfect.
Sure.
So that's why it's not suppressing emotions to say, oh, I'm not angry. Of course I'm angry, but if I really think about it, I can see that that is an irrational judgment. I shouldn't be irrational, you know. And if I'm good in reacting rationally or exercising discipline, denying that impulse to eat the donut, then I might deny some other more catastrophic impulses around the corner that in some other dimension. And that's why all these things cohere. And that kind of gets at the idea of the ideal human is multidimensional, and it applies, being an ideal human applies in all the different dimensions of being a human.
Very cool. Can you share one concrete high stake example where Stoicism or your Stoic application of the philosophy saved a mission rather than ending it?
Well, this isn't exactly what you asked, but the most concrete example of Stoicism applying in a military context is this guy named James Stockdale. And if you don't know who this guy is, then that's what you should know. You can do a whole other podcast series on this guy. But this is, it was actually through Stockdale's writings that I discovered at the Naval Academy when I was supposed to be studying mechanical engineering. That got me into it. I would go to the library in between classes and screw around, and I found his book. I'm like, what is this? And so Stockdale is a hero within the military, specifically within the Navy. His statues all over the place and everything. But he was a fighter pilot, and he was the air group commander in some of the early attacks that occurred from aircraft carriers in the Vietnam War. And he was shot down and captured by the North Vietnamese, and basically one of the early prisoners of war in the North Vietnamese prison system, or what they called the Hanoi Hilton. It was the same prison system that had John McCain in it and all that. He was part of that cohort.
Mhm.
But as the air group commander, he was the senior man in the environment, which in addition to being tortured and interrogated and all these things and all these attempts to co-opt him, he's the senior man there, which means it was his responsibility to be the commanding officer of the prisoners of war. That's just part of the deal. Is if you're the senior guy there, you're supposed to take charge. And so you could not have picked a more serendipitous person or a more appropriate person for that particular job than James Stockdale. And it happens that Stockdale was deeply read in the Stoics. He was deeply read in philosophy, period, but especially the Stoics. He had come across Epictetus, or had been introduced to Epictetus during his postgraduate education before that tour. And he, kept a copy of Epictetus by his bedside, and, was reading it all the time. And, he was also, just for the record, he was a Christian too, and went to church. He was an Episcopalian, but that's just an adjacent thing. But a lot of these ideas overlap. But he was really into Epictetus. And whenever he found himself in this prison torture regime where he had all this responsibility, and yet was being tortured to reveal information and to say bad things about his government and his country, he found that the teachings of Epictetus were extremely relevant to that situation. Epictetus is over here saying things about, what is me? I am my moral choice. And you can chain my leg, you can imprison my body, but that you can't harm me. You can't reach me. No antagonist or no extortionist can have any power over what is actually me. This body, this mortal coil, is just a vessel for what actually is me. And that, recognizing that, was a source of massive moral fortitude for Stockdale. And as a result, the guy was basically unbreakable. As when I say that is not an absolute. Everyone is breakable. Everyone is, no one can resist torture forever. But he was extremely uncooperative with his captors, and he basically created a resistance network within the prison system, and they communicated via tapped codes through the walls. Like they're in confinement, and yet he's able to issue directives that reverberate through the entire prison system of, okay, here's how you're going to react to being tortured. We know that you're going to eventually break. You know that you're going to eventually break, but here's how you deal with that. You're not going to just immediately collapse and just give them everything. You're going to, force them to torture you for these various, these are the various things that are prohibited actions that will require torture to get. You're just sorry, it sucks. You're just going to have to deal with that, and that's the rule. And whenever you come back, the Americans are your friends, not the enemy, because that was the game. Is if I can co-opt a prisoner, I can offer him special deals, offer him earlier release, or offer him early or special privileges, more comfortable arrangements. If you will just go on camera and call your country war criminals and support our political aims here. And that was expressly prohibited. So, but no matter what you do, American, absolution is found in the arms of Americans. You're ultimately going to be forgiven. Here's the guidebook, and Stockdale was in charge of all that.
Okay.
And the torturers basically found the Americans just completely incomprehensible and mind-boggling. Like, they're demanding torture. What is this? Like, this doesn't make any sense.
Sure.
They're crazy. These Americans are crazy. And it all traced back to, Stockdale being the leader of this. And he was, many of the survivors of that prison camp. He was there for 7 years, man, but
Yeah.
many of the survivors of that situation attribute their survival to him and his leadership. And so it's the kind of the quintessential example of moral leadership. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor ultimately for his his leadership there. And the story is much more complex than I'm giving it here. You can read his essays like for free. They're all available online. But like in the aftermath, in the years after Vietnam, he's later the president of the Naval War College, and later he's this public figure. He's speaking at the Hoover Institution and stuff like that. And he's talking about Epictetus, and he gives lots of lectures on Epictetus. And at this time, unless you're a philosophy professor, you don't know who the hell Epictetus is. It's like, what is this old man on about? But those lectures and essays are, you can find them for free. And that was how I came into Stoicism was him. But to your question of what's an example of a military commander who's applied Stoicism, like, that's the one. That is the key point there. Any listeners, if you're not familiar with James Stockdale and his story, that's something that's absolutely worth looking into.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And it impresses upon me the importance of having your own moral compass and having a clear understanding of who you are, like a self-awareness, and having self-agency, responsibility for yourself and what you do and how you do it.
There's an echo. There's been a little bit of an echo the whole time.
I'll get that cleaned up for us. Apologies. What I'd like to do then is pivot with this and explore how Stoicism as a warrior philosophy inside of the morality of military service plays out. What specifically in the book are you articulating? What message do you want to leave behind with the public? What is the overarching ethos of the book and the reason you publish this?
So the target audience is the military. But I think there's a lot in there for people who, if you're kind of a nerd about philosophy, if you're not a nerd about philosophy, it's not the entry point to Stoicism. I'd recommend Donald Robertson's, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, or something like that. Something a little bit easier reading. This is more of I'm making the argument about, I'm diving into, okay, how would Stoics look at the morality of war and the morality of military leadership? So my hope is, Stoicism is very popular in the military. It always has been. And it was popular in the military long before Silicon Valley discovered it. And
imagine that.
Yeah. Kind of my point is to say, as soon as it blew up in the popular sphere, you started having these guys that some people would say, like, well, if you really read the Stoics like I do, you would see that they think that military service is evil. And I'm like, wait, what? Or what are you talking about? Okay. And so that's why I get into the morality of war and just war theory and things like that, which that's like the final chapter. That's kind of like the payload. But I talk through, I break down the theories of how the philosophy works, kind of like we've been talking about here. That's like the first couple of chapters, and then
Yes.
I get into the concept of moral obligation and duty, and how those things play in a social context, and how those things with interact with ideas like patriotism and cosmopolitanism and things like that. And then all that ultimately informs the theory of justified warfare, that kind of the last chapter deals with. And there's an entire tradition of just war theory that it kind of acts with. I kind of hold the Stoic view up to the just war tradition in the final chapter. It's basically, the book's trying to do a lot of things. I would like it to be well read within the military. I think it answers a need that somebody needed to write this and to dive into this topic. But I think that when you interact with good ideas, you can't help but be altered in a positive way. And I hope to alter the military in a positive way. And however minuscule, if a few people, a few key leaders read these ideas, I hope that they will be better people, and find different ways to be the better people that they want to be, or different avenues or paths to that. And I hope that will help the military to be better for this country and help this country to be better. All those things. In addition, I don't mind if a few people that aren't in the military read this and say, like, oh, it turns out I thought that the military were just a bunch of dumb brutes. It turns out that these are actually thinking moral agents. And I thought that the perfect warrior is someone who's like perfectly obedient, unthinking. And I kind of hope to
Wow. Yes.
place that notion in relief. Is the
Maybe
idea.
maybe I know enough people that have served or are serving, and that's never been my impression, but I appreciate you putting it out there. Is there a new insight or a new revelation that you bring forward in the book that's the aha moment for someone that is a student of Stoicism?
I think there are a few. And again, these are framings. So I don't think I'm
Mm.
thinking of anything new here, but I think I'm presenting some very old ideas from maybe a different angle, presenting what has been popularized as the dichotomy of control instead as a philosophical razor is, I think, one example of an idea that, just kind of as I was writing the book, it kind of dawned on me, like, this is probably the best way to present this, that I think captures this idea in a more, more whole way, more
Uh,
more complete way than the kind of popular take on it. The way that I describe moral obligation and duty within the Stoics' theory of nature, I think is helpful for people who were students who are already into Stoicism to try to just articulate the concept of moral duty. I think reconciling the concepts of patriotic duty with the cosmopolitanism of the Stoics, and basically showing how those things are not conflicts if we apprehend everything, if we fully think through the problem and place our priorities where they should be, then those things are not incompatible. And patriotism is not the same thing as chauvinistic nationalism and all those things. And so I kind of get into that stuff in the fifth chapter. I think that has not necessarily been articulated well in a popular text, and then the basically holding up Stoicism to just war theory and the concepts of how a warrior thinks through these very, very tough decisions from a Stoic perspective, I think has not been done. I'm not aware of someone else who's done that very well in kind of a book form.
Does the book touch on AI in any realm or level? And I ask this question because Stoicism is such a unique philosophy to me. And I look at AI and its prevalence in today's society and certainly tomorrow, and AI constantly pushing for certainty, 99% certainty, and what happens to the human in this process. And here's a machine built for perfect judgment, per se. Well, that's a relative term, but here's a commander, military force that's utilizing algorithmic outputs to drive decisions as well. Does the book interplay in that in any way, or is that a whole nother rabbit hole to dive into later?
It's definitely another rabbit hole. So I don't talk about AI any. What I do talk about that's like adjacent to this kind of discussion in this direction is the fragmentation of tasking and the fragmentation of very grave moral decisions that you actually see. And most like thought experiments in the just war tradition are basically they're always infantry and on infantry. Guy with a rifle, and I'm dealing with guy with a rifle. But like real war is vastly more complex than that. And I've got these missile strikes where one person orders the strike, another person chooses the targets, another person pulls the trigger, and another person maintains the system that launches the weapon whenever the trigger was pulled in this one place. And like, where is responsibility for the killing and all that?
Nice.
Who
Yes.
and so I talk about that some, and basically, I touch upon it, and basically, how does a
Cool.
moral agent play into this network of decisions, and where would a real stoic, a wise person, consent to be a part of this network of decisions with grave moral consequences, sometimes gravely immoral consequences. Yeah, I talk about that. I see fitting into that is one of the ways that it's a decision making tool, and like that is a very interesting rabbit hole. I don't talk about it very much, but it is almost there's just a lot better people to talk about that than me. It's almost a new the ethics of autonomous warfare are like a burgeoning new field of philosophy that is very interesting, with some very important questions and very tough moral dilemmas involved in them. And like, we could do a whole series of episodes on the ethics of autonomy and warfare. And maybe I'll get into it someday, but there's just other people who've written better on
Oh,
it.
fantastic. Thank you for that. To that point, what I'd like to do, if you're comfortable, is hit you with 3 high stakes scenarios. Have a little fun here.
Yeah.
And
And for the listeners, I'm not prepared for this. I have no idea what he's going to ask me.
yeah, I'm going to ask you what your command's going to be. Are you good for this?
Sure, let's rock.
All right. So your ship's tactical system recommends an immediate preemptive strike that violates every ethical guideline you hold. But the system, whether it's AI or just the system, insists its probability of success is like 99.9%. You have 5 seconds to decide between human virtue or near perfect success, algorithmic certainty. What's your command?
Well, what would a good person do? I'm going to do that. All right. So for one thing, what you kind of described there is, if it violates every ethical, scruple that I have, all things considered, I'm not going to do it, period. But the all things considered, there's a lot packed into that. Within the all things considered has to be, my reliability of information, how well what I think and how well my uncertainties are founded versus the system that I'm a part of. What are the consequences of my failing to take this action? What are the potential consequences? And there's going to be a lot of justified trust in institutions and training that are going to be baked into that too, into that information of all things considered. And that's going to inform my, all of my scruples that play into this question. The interesting point that you're getting at is on the idea of like obedience and disobedience. And I do address this some, and I have to be careful what I say here, because, I'm not going around encouraging people to disobey orders on moral grounds. I'm telling you that they will, okay, because they're human beings. And if, whenever you go through basic training, everyone down to the most basic soldiers today, this was not always true. This is a very fairly modern phenomenon though. But, troops are trained to disobey orders that are illegal. And okay, what does that mean? And like, we're not going to touch, current events. I don't talk about current events because that's just not my role. There's better people to do that.
Sure.
But these are principles that are always true. Okay. And whenever you're going through basic training and you say like, well, I read about the My Lai massacre and I don't ever want to be a part of that, they kind of tell you, well, like, that's okay because you're supposed to, those were manifestly illegal orders and you're supposed to disobey manifestly illegal orders. So you can rest assured, that you're not going to be faced with that situation. And I can say like, okay, well, that may be true. I and all of the troops are trained to disobey illegal orders. Good. Okay, that's good. And that's a positive development that is kind of a recent phenomenon. There's a lot of good reasons that that's true, and it's good for military effectiveness. The moral dimension has got to be part of any theory of military victory today. But okay, let's take that and let's table it. What about orders that are legal and yet morally intolerable? What we might call lawful but awful orders. What about that? So what I will say is that most moral philosophers are agreed that a warfighter is morally justified to disobey an order that they find morally intolerable, but they're not legally justified. And so they've got to be willing to
Mm.
accept the legal consequences that are going to come from that. And that's got to be part of the moral calculation. Now, if you're a Stoic, those legal consequences are a moral indifferent. At the same time, you need to consider all the factors, such as the oaths that you've sworn, the people that are depending on you, and yada yada yada. So the topic of obedience and disobedience, I do address. It's a tough topic, but the key point that I want taken away there is that the individual continues to be a deciding moral agent. Okay, so I can say, all right, soldier, I need you to go bayonet that baby over there. And he's going to say, sir, I'm not going to do that. That's an illegal order. And I can say, right here, Congress just voted bayoneting babies is legal. It's the thing. This is the law. That soldier is still going to say, I'm still not going to do that.
Right.
I don't know.
Sure.
I'm not doing it. And that's my point. Okay, is that the morality of the individual agent is not contingent wholly on the law. We want the law to be aligned with morality. That's philosophy of law, and that's important. And desirable moral outcomes
Wow.
need to be part of it.
Yes.
But the individual is always going to be an individual. And he's always going to be a thinking moral agent. And we want them. We want that. We want the individuals to be thinking moral agents. That's important in a warrior. And that's a controversial point, and that's one of the things I get at.
Well, of course, follow orders, don't follow orders, be a thinking person. How do you have a command over a large group of people when there's not a chain of command and, a specific mission? I understand that, which brings me to reputational loss and a question on that end, which I think I know the answer based on our prior scenario, but let's lean in on this one. You act on a purely virtuous but highly unpopular decision during a crisis, saving lives but costing you your reputation, your career progress, and your entire public standing. The external world judges you as a failure. What is the Stoics' command then?
Stoic doesn't care.
So
All those things are trinkets. All those things are fish heads that seagulls scramble over. Like let the seagulls scramble over the fish heads. Reputation. Give me a break.
how many flag officers today do you think are Stoics?
So let me be clear. Like I'm not necessarily able to think that way. Neither is any other human. Okay. The point there is what would perfect look like? What would a perfect human, how would a perfect human react to the situation? And if I can contemplate how a perfect human being would react to the situation, or a perfect wise person, if I can contemplate that and I can say like, okay, a perfect wise person would do this or would think this way. I'm clearly going to do this and think this way, but at least I recognize that that's imperfect, and by contemplating how a perfect person would react and a perfect person would understand, I am necessarily moved closer to that ideal. Okay. And so that's an important point of contemplating what perfection would be, but still being able to accept that I am not perfect. I'm never gonna be. All right. But the more I think about it, the more I try, the more I put forth the effort to be perfect. So if I put forth the effort to not care about status or reputation, like vanities, those are just that's just vanity. This is Ecclesiastes, man. Like all of that is just triviality and vanity.
Yeah, vanity carries some economic and serious repercussions in today's society as well, though, right? So
Yeah.
I
Okay.
appreciate where you're coming from with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last scenario, I consider this a bit of an aftermath of the aforementioned. And let's imagine a critical operational failure occurs on your watch, and that results in the unfortunate loss of personnel. And the grief is internal, it's visceral, it's crushing, it's a true moment of psychological defeat. The loss was entirely outside of your control. What is the Stoics' command now?
Well, grief is going to be really, really hard. I mean, the answer is actually the same when it's in the past. It's something that's happened. Like, what if it was within my control? What if I made a mistake? Like that would be a very hard thing for a human being to deal with. Stoic response is going to be to say, I cannot control anything in the past. I can control how I react to this and what I do now. And I'm going to exercise that control for the benefit of all who depend on me. Okay. So that does not mean I'm going to go out there like a machine and talk like a calculator. I'm going to interact with my people and the families and everything like a human being. I'm going to present as a fully functioning, not emotionally unintelligent human being. That's my moral obligation
Fantastic.
is to react in that way. So I hope that gets at that question. And to be clear, I've never suffered a loss like that.
Thankfully.
That's not been my military experience. Mine's something else. I'm a submarine guy, but that's what I think would be the stoic answer to that.
Well, I appreciate that. I was just imagining different scenarios and curious as to how that model would be approached. So I appreciate it. I appreciate your definition of commanding and the leadership involved. And, thank you for showing us what the Stoic warrior looks like today, and yourself and others, and tomorrow. If someone would like to get in touch with you for a speaking engagement, book signing event, lecture, anything of the above, how would you like for them to go about touching base with you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm on LinkedIn. Well, I mean, easy to find there. I've also got a website, williamcspears.com. There's a contact form there. I'm in the DC area, and I love nerding out on this stuff and talking about it. So if anyone wants to talk about it, I'm easy to find. And I'm basically here until summer of 26, at which point I turn into a pumpkin, and the Navy's going to want me back. I'm going to be rowing again. I'll be back in the command pipeline from that point, and then I'm unavailable. But for now, I love talking about this kind of stuff. So even if it's just over coffee.
Yeah, this is great. Awesome. Friends, family, and cohorts, the book is Stoicism as a Warrior Philosophy. It is a critical resource for anyone seeking a resilient moral framework under pressure. It is an essential read. It's available at Barnes and Noble. It's available at Amazon.com. It's in stock. Place your order before Christmas. It's a great read. If you want to dive deeper into the mind of a high performer, you can find more work at williamspear.com. Links will be in the show notes. Until next time, stay disciplined, stay virtuous, and keep asking the difficult questions. Commander, thank you for your time and your
Thanks a lot, Miles.
service.